Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for Mrs. Ballou Reads, and we're headed to read the final chapters in Tumtum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. We've been reading The Pirate's Treasure. This book is by Emily Bearn, and pictures are by Nick Price. And it is published by Hatchet Book Group Incorporated. Final 3 chapters. If you remember, we left the Nutmouses and General Marshmouse. They had tricked the rats into eating the chocolate liqueurs that they originally thought were golden bricks, and hoping that they'll be able to leave them behind if they eat enough of these chocolate liqueurs. They told them that the more they eat, the richer they'll become. Chapter 13. There followed the most revolting scene. Tumtum had told the rats that the more liqueurs they ate, the richer they would become. So they weren't going to let Captain Pong scoff the lot. It was each rat for himself as they all fell upon the boat, tearing the gold wrappers off the chocolates and frantically sinking their fangs into the dark shells. The chocolates were thick and hard, and the rats had to gnaw like crazy to reach the magic centers. As the rats finally chewed through to the middle, each chocolate released a torrent of sickly syrup. Soon the whole beach was awash. The rats stood back in fright, for the liquid was giving off an overwhelming smell. It was like burned sugar, but much more intoxicating. It was so strong, it made their eyes water. There they are, getting into the chocolate liqueurs. "It's petrol," one of them declared, holding his nose. "It's poison," another rat said. Their suspicions were mounting, and the general's trick might easily have fallen through had it not been for Tumtum's quick-wittedness. He could see that the rats needed encouragement, so he fell to his knees with a groan of delight and started slurping. "Oh, heavenly nectar," he cried, briefly coming up for air. In actual fact, Tumtum was only pretending. He was not swallowing anything at all. But the rats were fooled, and at the rate Tumtum appeared to be drinking, they feared there would be nothing left for them. "Get out of there, you greedy brute," the Captain Pong grunted, hauling Tumtum aside by his collar. Then all of the rats fell on the ground and started spooning up huge parfuls of the mysterious brown syrup. They ate with bitter rivalry. Not a word was exchanged. There was nothing to be heard except for the smack, smack, smack of their jaws. The mice watched anxiously, waiting for the first signs of silliness. But the rats just went on gorging. Presently, however, Captain Pong rose to his knees, his face the color of beets. He could sense a great giggle rising in his stomach. He was usually a very serious rat, but now he felt dizzy and carefree. It was as if all his ratty pride had been stripped away and his head had been filled with mush. He turned to Tumtum, who looked a bit fuzzy, and gave a loud ick. "Good morrow to you, Mr. Nutmouse," he said. Of course, it was a silly thing to say, but you'd say something silly, too, if you'd been gobbling chocolate liqueurs. Without waiting for Tumtum to reply, the captain staggered to the margarine tub and pulled another chocolate from the pile. Then the white rat lurched to his feet. He was also flushed, and there was syrup oozing down his chin. He made to follow Captain Pong, but he was walking very strangely. For every step he took forward, he went 3 steps back. Finally, he fell over and landed on his bottom. The other rats had got up now, and they were having a fine old time of it, stumbling about in the mud and giggling until the tears coursed down their snouts. Then one of them grabbed another's paw, and soon they were all prancing in circles, braying their boating song to the moon. "Rob, rob, rob the boats cruelly down the stream. Greedily, 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 life is but a dream." When they had finished, they all fell down. Tumtum and Nutmeg looked on in astonishment. The general was right. A drunk rat was a sight to behold. "Come on," the general hissed. "Now's our time to escape." Chapter 14. It was a glorious night to escape. The sky was a deep blue, and the moonlight was catching on the pond's surface, making it beam. The mice slunk silently across the beach and clambered onto the raft. Then Tumtum and the general took the oars and started pulling out toward Lady Crossbones. Nutmeg kept glancing back, fearing the rats might suddenly pounce after them. "I shouldn't worry if I were you," the general said carelessly. "They're in no state to chase us now. I tell you, they're so drunk it'll be morning before they even notice we're gone." They rowed around the ship's stern and drew up on the far side out of sight of the cove. The general tied tightly to the guardrail, for they would need it when they had crossed the pond. And with both the ship and the raft gone, the rats would be stranded. But they would never be able to sail. Oh, they still had the margarine tub, of course, but they would never be able to sail away in that. It was barely big enough for one rat, let alone 5. When the raft was secure, the mice scrambled up the side of the ship and dropped down onto the deck. The lantern was still lit, casting a forlorn glow around the mast. There was a woodworm nibbling the water keg, and the remains of the rat's supper, fly fillets and mashed slugs, had been left strewn on the stove. There they are, getting on the ship. Tumtum quickly began hauling up the anchor, but the general was too excited for such practicalities. Ever since he was a small boy, he had dreamed of having his own boat, and now he did. "She's mine!" he cried, strutting the deck with delight. "Steady on, General," Tumtum said. "We're only using her to escape in. You can't keep her. She's much too big for you." "Of course I can keep her," the general replied. "She shall become my private yacht. I shall repaint her and replace that horrid cat with a handsome figurehead of myself, and I shall give her a new name, such as Lady Marchmouse. Yes, Lady Marchmouse has a pleasant ring to it. But what will you do with her?" Tumtum asked. He was tugging down on the sails, anxious to be off. "A yacht is a big responsibility, you know." "Oh, fiddlesticks," replied the general, who seemed in no hurry to set sail. "I shall moor her along the stream, somewhere nice and tucked away, where the moles and the otters won't find her. And then, whenever there's a nice sunny day, I shall come tapping at your door, Mr. Nutmouse, saying, 'Do join me for a cruise on the Lady Marchmouse.' That's what I'll say. Then we shall wave our wives toodle-pip, and off we'll go on our pleasure boat, just you and me, titans of the stream, waving royally to all we see." Neither Tumtum nor Nutmeg liked the sound of this, but their bigger concern was getting home. "Come on, General, help me tighten the sails," Tumtum grunted. Neither mouse was an experienced sailor. So much of what followed was guesswork. They heaved down on various ropes and pulled on this lever and that until suddenly they felt a great force above them. The mast heaved, the cloth strained, then the gold sails flared out in the breeze. The general ran to the wheel and wrenched it down until the ship was pointing away from the island. They were free at last, slicing silently toward the moonlit horizon, and they might have easily have escaped unseen, for the rats had not noticed the ship pulling away. But the general could not resist a chance to show off. "Take the wheel," he ordered Tumtum. Then he grabbed the lantern down from the mast and raced back to the stern. The ship was inching on fast, but he could still see the rats dancing on the shore. He leaned over the rail, filled his lungs with air, and shouted, "Cheerio!" The rats heard the general's voice echoing around the cove. They wobbled to a halt and looked stupidly over their shoulders. Then they turned toward the pond and finally noticed their ship blowing away. There he is with the lantern. "Oi!" they all cried. They stumbled to the shore and waded drunkenly into the water. Their joy had given way to a terrible rage. "Come back or we'll eat you alive," Captain Pong roared. But his threats were empty now, and Lady Crossbones sailed on heedlessly into the night. Soon all the rats could see was the silhouette of the great General Marchmouse waving gloatingly from the stern. "We're free!" Nutmeg said rapturously, grasping Tumtum's paw, and even Tumtum let out a whoop, so relieved was he to have escaped. But their trials were not over yet, for the voyage was long and grueling, and Lady Crossbones proved devilishly hard to control. No sooner had she blown 6 feet from the shore than she was caught by a fierce headwind, which sent her buffeting around in circles. Tumtum and Nutmeg tugged with all their might on the sail, and the general tried to wrench the wheel, but the gusts were too strong for them, and Lady Crossbones refused to go on. "Blast this vessel," the general fumed. "What's the use of a ship that dances around in circles?" He had already burned his paws pulling on the sail ropes, and he was in a foul humor. Being in command of such a big ship wasn't turning out to be nearly such fun as he expected. He wished he had a smaller, nimbler boat, like Bluebottle, but Bluebottle was no more. Eventually the swell eased, and the breeze caught in the sails again, nudging them on. But when they had gone a little further, a freak wave smashed over the deck, tipping the boat to starboard and nearly washing Nutmeg overboard. "Ugh!" she cried, clinging for dear life to the mast. Tumtum and the general both rushed to her side and held her tight. When the ship steadied, they all collapsed on the deck, soaked through and exhausted. It was a miserable voyage, and to make matters worse, there was no fresh water and nothing to eat but the rancid remains of the rat's supper, and there weren't any comfortable beds. It was many hours later and almost light when Lady Crossbones finally approached the main bank of the pond. "Lady, ahoy!" the general cried weakly, guiding her in around a clump of weeds. By the time the ship reached dry land, even General Marchmouse was fed up. "I'm not sure Lady Crossbones is the right boat for me," he said. What did I tell you?" Tumtum replied. "Well, never mind, General. If you don't want her, we can just abandon her here on the bank." "We can't do that," the general said. "If we leave her here, the rats will reclaim her. They're sure to find their way back from the island one day, and once they've got the Lady Crossbones back, they'll be able to start pirating again." Tumtum considered this for a moment. The general was right. Without their ship, the rats would be much less dangerous. "I have an idea," Nutmeg said. "Why don't we give Lady Crossbones to the children as a present? It was our fault that the blue bottle sank, so now we can make it up to them. I can leave them a letter in the attic tonight explaining what happened and telling them that if they come down to the pond as soon as they've had breakfast, they'll find a new boat waiting for them. Imagine how delighted they'll be." "That's a splendid plan," Tumtum said. "We can warn them that she'll need a good scrub," Nutmeg went on, "and I'll tell them to repaint her and give her a new name so everyone will know she's not a pirate ship anymore." "Well, that's settled then," the general said, relieved to have the ship off his paws. As the three mice lowered the sails, ready to disembark, the general looked back a moment at the pond, searching through the weeds and the rushes for one last glimpse of Marchmouse Island. But it was invisible now, lost beyond the vast horizon. He felt a stab of longing. It was his island, his alone, and one of these days he would go back there. But the pond looked so big, he wondered if he would ever find it again. He turned back to the shore and saw the dawn rising beyond the meadow. With a sudden start, he realized that he'd been away from the gun cupboard for 3 whole nights. He had given Mrs. Marchmouse clear instructions not to worry about him, but he suspected she might not be following them. "I had better be getting home," he said. Chapter 15, the final chapter. A few hours later, Lucy woke up. She wanted to find out if Nutmeg had come back, but suddenly she felt afraid. Instead of rushing out of bed, she turned her face into the pillow and lay with her eyes shut tight. A minute went by. Then she pulled herself together and sat up. Arthur was still sleeping. Quietly, so as not to wake him, she walked over to the dresser. And with a rush of relief, she saw a tiny envelope propped against her hairbrush. "Arthur, she's back!" she cried. While her brother was still rubbing his eyes, she found the magnifying glass in the drawer of her bedside table and read Nutmeg's letter out loud. "Thanks to your wonderful trick, I have escaped, but events took quite a turn and went much better than we might have planned. In the end, I stole Lady Crossbones from under the rats' very snouts and snailed her home by the light of the moon, leaving the pirates marooned on the island. It was quite a night. But we must never allow the pirates to reclaim their ship, for then they will start pirating again. So from now on, Lady Crossbones belongs to you. She will need a wash, of course, and a fresh coat of paint, and perhaps a dab of superglue on her rudder. But for the most part, she is in good shape, and I believe you will find much to admire in her. I have moored her on the southern bank of the pond, near the tree stump with moss on it. Now hurry, my dears, and claim her before someone else does. Love, Nutmeg. P.S. I would not send the rats any more chocolates if I were you. Rich food has a bad effect on them." The children were overwhelmed. At best, they had hoped they would get Nutmeg back. They hadn't expected a new boat as well. "Come on, let's go and find it," Arthur said. They got dressed, then hurried downstairs and let themselves out into the garden. It was very early. The village had not yet stirred, and the grass was still covered in dew. They shut the back door quietly so as not to wake their father, then ran across the meadow to the pond. The children did not know which way was south, but they soon spotted the tree stump that Nutmeg had described. It was on the far side of the pond, where the grass had been trampled by sheep. They ran over to it, and when they parted the weeds, they found Lady Crossbones moored against the bank. She did not look so menacingly at close range. Her huge gold sails had been tied down, and there was a snail snoozing on the deck. The children carefully lifted the boat from the water and stood it on the grass. Then they knelt down and peered through the portholes, examining each cabin in turn. Everything looked very real. There were rugs on the floor, blankets on the beds, and clothes spilling from the dresser. And there were paintings hanging from the walls, big, gloomy portraits, mainly of rats, and silver candlesticks on the bedside tables. Arthur felt no regrets for Bluebottle now. This was the best toy boat he had ever seen. Nutmeg's right. We should repaint her. Black's too sinister, Lucy said. We should give her a new name. Lady Crossbones sounds silly. Let's call her Lady Nutmeg, Arthur said. Lucy agreed to this, so Lady Nutmeg she became. Do you think the pirates will be stuck on the island forever? Lucy said. Arthur shrugged. I don't see how they'll get back without a boat. It was strange to think there were pirates on the pond, but many strange things had happened to Arthur and Lucy, so they supposed it must be true. They longed for a glimpse of them, but when they looked across the island, all they could see was the margarine tub, upturned on the bank, and a few gold chocolate wrappers scattered along the shore. I wonder if we'll ever see them, Lucy said. I should think we're bound to one day, Arthur replied. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He'd had enough of pirates for now. Come on, let's take Lady Nutmeg home and start painting her, he said. They lifted the boat between them, for it was very heavy, and turned back toward the cottage. But had they watched the island a moment longer, they would have seen something stir, for just then Captain Pong, who had slept all night under a crisp wrapper in the cove, rolled over and gave a loud belch. And there's not much more to say about the rats. The captain had become quite frenzied when he saw the mice escaping in his ship, and had tried to chase after them in the margarine tub. But it was much too small for him, and he had capsized a few inches from the shore. The other rats could say nothing to console him that evening, but next morning, when they all took stock of the situation, things didn't seem so bad, for it was a glorious day, and they still had lots of chocolates left, and now that General Marchmouse had gone, the island was all theirs again, which made them feel quite rich in a way, for as Captain Pong rightly observed, it's not every rat who has an island in the sun. Meanwhile, the general had returned home to a cheerful reunion with Mrs. Marchmouse. Just as he feared, she had been worrying about him nonstop. The general often went off exploring on his own, but it was most unlike him to stay away for as long as this. She was beginning to feel sure something awful must have happened to him, and she was just putting on her bonnet, ready to go out and summon help, when suddenly he burst through the cupboard door. Marchie, she cried weakly, throwing herself upon his mousely chest. And the general was so touched by her concern that he promised he would never go venturing again. This would have come as welcome news to Tumtum and Nutmeg, who felt the general had embroiled them in quite enough trouble as it was. And it was a wonderful moment when they finally crept back into the broom cupboard and saw their beloved Nutmouse hall again. They'd been away so long that everything looked dusty and neglected. A fly had knocked over the milk jug on the kitchen table, and there was a spider bathing in the sink. Nutmeg was too tired to tackle these upsets now. She had barely slept all night, and she could feel herself fading. Tumtum suddenly noticed how drawn she looked. You sit down, and I'll make some breakfast, he said. They both felt much better when they had eaten some porridge. Then Tumtum made a pot of tea, and they sat at the table for a long while, mulling things over. What is it with us, Tumtum? Nutmeg asked. No sooner is one adventure over than another seems to come along. Tumtum leaned back in his chair, considering this problem. What they both liked most of all was peace and quiet, so all this excitement did seem rather bad luck. But then it occurred to them they might not appreciate their peaceful days nearly so much if there wasn't the occasional adventure to interrupt them. And he was about to explain this to Nutmeg, but he dozed off while thinking how to phrase it. The end. All done with Tumtum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. So next week we will start a new chapter book to read. And today's secret code is Captain. I hope you enjoyed these last 3 chapters, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about Tumtum and Nutmeg and General Marchmouse. And this book is available for checkout for anybody that would like to read it on their own. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Miss you guys all. Take care. Bye.